So Greenfield Lake was a man-made pond or lake by one of these enslaved individuals, and collectively their forced labor. And it was created because this area is an inland rice plantation, as opposed to much of the narrative here in southeastern North Carolina, which is a tidal rice plantation. So rice requires several flushings or several floodings of the land. Not only does flooding the land where the rice is being produced help the seedling germinate, but it also impedes crows and other birds' abilities to take away the seed, and it also helps avoid weeds or other competing plants. So upwards of 3 times in the production of rice, you need to flood your fields. And the narrative that we're kind of familiar with here in southeastern North Carolina, if you go down further down the Gullah Geechee corridor into maybe Georgetown, South Carolina, but down towards Savannah, the flooding of these rice plantations or fields occurred through the natural forces of tides. The tide comes in, and through man-made dikes and canals and trunks, think of a trunk as a door. You can either close the trunk so the incoming tide doesn't flood your field, or you can leave it open when you want that incoming tide to flood your field, trunks as in doors. It all uses the tides, the natural world. When you go down to MORTON Plantation or some of the other plantations between here and the mouth of the Cape Fear River, obviously the closer you get to the open ocean, the stronger that tidal activity will be. Thus, it'll be easier to flood your rice fields. Greenfield Lake, we're what, 28, 29 miles from the mouth of the Cape Fear River. And before the continual dredging of the Cape Fear River, what are we at, 42 feet now? 40 some, 40, roughly 40 feet now? We're looking for 47. I'll sit that on that table over there. So before the dredging of the river, right, before man's changing of the landscape, those tidal forces would have been less strong because the river channel was less deep. So for Dr. Greenfield's he needed to figure out how to use natural forces to flood his rice fields with this forced labor. And the way he would do it is by creating a dam and a man-made reservoir. So you can use the dam or the reservoir and either open the trunk so the reservoir would flood the fields that are downstream, or you could close the trunk or the door and keep that reservoir in the lake when you wanted your fields to be dried out. So this is a great kind of visual from I think it was the Rice Museum down in Georgetown. I want to thank Natalie and Ron Days for this. You have the higher land. So think of the higher land as like downtown Wilmington. And then you have all this swamp land. Think of that as modern day Greenfield Lake. And all those lines would be your creeks, your springs, and so forth. So what through those enslaved Gullah Geechee people forced labor, what Dr. Green is going to create is something that looks like this. So you have your reservoir, you have Greenfield Lake up there. You have your man-made dam or your trunk, which is where the spillway or the causeway is today. And then through that forced labor, you are going to level out all the fields downstream of your reservoir or lake. And you open that trunk when you want those fields to be flooded. You close the trunk when you want those fields to be dry. And then further downstream is going to be your river or the saltwater marsh or swamp in between your lake and your river. So let's look at another visual to kind of help describe this. This is an actual plan from plantation that's just kind of in between Charleston and Columbia. And this should look really familiar to you all if you can envision what an aerial perspective of Greenfield Lake looks like. Imagine this river is the Cape Fear River. Imagine here you have Greenfield Lake. This is another man-made lake in South Carolina. Looks really similar, right? You have all these fingers. Those are where the streams are dumping into this man-made lake to naturally replenish the reservoir. And then the line I have behind this line is the dam or the man-made dike. And then you have your rice fields in between the dam and the reservoir and that river. So that was that map from South Carolina there. And it was just showing you, and I'm glad you all agree, I'm not crazy, it looks like Greenfield Lake. So the rice fields today would be at modern day, like it would be west of 3rd and Front Street, where the modern day Port of Wilmington is today. Or if you all heard of Optimus Park, that the city just gifted to the Port of Wilmington for expansion, where all these terminals are, that's where the rice fields would have been. It would have been downstream from Greenfield Lake, in between the lake or the man-made reservoir, to allow that flushing of the fields and the Cape Fear River. So let's apply this to a map from Greenfield. This is, to my knowledge, this is about as far back as I can go in terms of a map of Greenfield Lake. This is a map that was produced by a Confederate engineer during the Civil War, Benjamin Lewis Blackford. He was a Virginian, and he came down here to work on General Whiting's staff. And you can see this would be modern day Carolina Beach Road, that red line. There's, you have your spillway or your dam, there it is today. And you'll notice the lake or the reservoir is much smaller than we know it today. And those fingers, as we know in Greenfield Lake, are being produced or fed by these various streams that are coming from the high ground. And then those lines, where Optimus Park and the port are, those are your rice fields. So when you want to flush your field, you open the trunk in the dike, or when you want to dry it out, you close it and you let all that water drain into the Cape Fear River. So hundreds of enslaved persons were the first humans to map or to intentionally create what we see as Greenfield Lake today, and the flatness of Optimus Park today. Let's put it into a 21st century context. The DOT is doing a significant amount of work on Burnett Boulevard, Carolina Beach Road, South Front Street. In fact, the city gave up Optimus Park. I used to play kickball at Optimus Park. Anybody use Optimus Park? It's terrible. It's just mud and mud and mud. That's intentional. That was created by these enslaved persons with their hands and their forced labor because they needed a flat area for those rice fields. Modern day repercussions of an 18th century intentional act. So one more just for fun. This is, I put this up here. Nicholas Shank is a great resource. He was a gentleman who lived in Wilmington right around the time of the American Civil War. But it's kind of like Mary Chestnut. He wrote his diary after the fact, so it's not really a diary, but that's how it's marketed. It's really like a recollection. That's why I always remind folks it's circa 1905, but he's telling us about circa 1850. I don't know about y'all, but 50 years, do you remember 50 years ago in precise language? Like, you know, Mrs. Smith lived at this house, or I don't know. So you always have to take Nicholas Shank with a grain of salt. But what you're looking at is a map that was created by a UNCW history student under the guidance of Chris Fonville just maybe a decade or so ago. based on the descriptions of the language that Nicholas Schenck is recounting in this diary. And so you have the Cape Fear River, and then you have the industry south of the Cape Fear River, where Castle Street Queen is, where we are standing right now, actually, because Clarendon Iron Works is in here. And then you have number 11, that's a canal, and you have 12 rice fields. All those fields where we are south of us. The lake would be down in here. And you have labels, a canal, rice field, and then green mill. To the ruins, old greenhouse, and from Greenfield Lake. So that use continues for much of the 19th century. And the reservoir changes its significance from a use of flooding the fields to a use of a gristmill. And that is reflected in the changing economics of southeastern North Carolina throughout the 19th century, and then accelerated when the enslaved people are emancipated come the occupation of Wilmington in 1865. Rice is, as we discussed at length, a labor-intensive crop to cultivate. Without that forced labor, it becomes unrealistic to generate wealth from rice. So the lake becomes less about flooding the rice fields and more about using a water propellant to grind corn into cornmeal. That is what is being discussed here with the green mill. But as the urbanization of Wilmington comes along, I want to move on to the second individual I want to highlight. That is SALLIE HICKS. I love this quote. As women often do, they acted. April 5th, 1936. So SALLIE HICKS was the wife of Rufus Hicks. Their house was on the 400 block of South 3rd Street. And she was in the 1890s, the individuals that helped start North Carolina SOROSIS. North Carolina SOROSIS was organized on the 4th of December, 1895 by about 15 women. SOROSIS is a Greek word. It means a cluster of flowers with one stem. The idea was these various ladies, well-to-do ladies, call them upper class, gentle women, they all through their various efforts could unite with one stem and make a difference here in Wilmington. And it's an outgrowth of the Southern progressive movement. It's this outgrowth of the increasing political and economic agency of women in the South as we are nearing the 19th Amendment. And the less intimidating way for women to become involved politically at this time is through social causes that are the brainchildren of the progressive movement. For example, look at the first products or the first projects of SOROSIS, the creation of a library, the creation of playgrounds, the creation of first aid training, and various kind of I would call them triage centers in Wilmington. The uplifting of the lower classes, and these projects are not necessarily intimidating from the ruling male class at this time. And that lands us by the 1920s to Greenfield Lake. What is not intimidating but a progressive cause? The creation of a public park in this former reservoir created by these enslaved ants. So SALLIE HICKS, what occurred was there was a two private firms that owned Greenfield Lake, and they were creating an attraction. They put in amenities such as bathhouses, boat docks, beaches. Yes, there was swimming in Greenfield Lake. They actually imported sand and would create a sandy beach. And a sandy bottom of the lake in the swimming areas. But once stressors in the economy occurred. Once the beach season and beach tourism grew in southeastern North Carolina, going to the lake became less and less attractive for the local population and tourists alike. They prefer the beach. And just with capitalism, when you don't have income, the owner is not going to invest in the upkeep of the lake. So by 1921, we have a lake that is an eyesore. And that's when Sally Hicks and her 14 counterparts in North Carolina, SOROSIS, stand up to the plate, as women do. They acted, they decided that this was going to be the next project in North Carolina, SOROSIS. And they launched this political campaign or lobbyist campaign to influence Wilmington City Council and Union River County Commissioners to buy the lake. And due to a process that's not dissimilar to today's local government commission, you think like North Carolina government or the Union River Government Center or Project Grace. You know, when you're financing a big project, you need to put it to a referendum. The 2016 Transportation and Parks Bond and so forth, a very similar process. This had to go to referendum because the spending money the bill was about $25,000 or so. So it was up to these women, Sally Hicks in charge, to launch this information campaign across the city of Wilmington to convince the men at this time, the men, to vote to acquire this lake. Spend the $25,000 to turn it into a public park. They were unsuccessful in 1924, but they persisted and they won the referendum in 1925, and the city of Wilmington purchased the lake for $25,000. And to dedicate, after 1932, when the park was already established and Sally Hicks had passed away, there was in fact a marble statue that was placed in Greenfield Park. And this postcard is taken from the perspective of modern day Burnett Boulevard, or I call it 3rd Street, I guess it's officially Burnett Boulevard, looking to the spillway or the causeway. That is where in the 18th century that dam would have been to flood, or the trunk or the door. Today it's that waterfall, and you have where you walk in the modern day park on the sidewalk behind there. That's where it was placed. And what you're seeing is, this is Sally Hicks on the right, and she's lifting up I would say he looks somewhat impoverished young man. She's reaching down and trying to lift him up. And that's essential to understand why Sally Hicks and these other women in the Southern Progressive Movement launched this campaign, spent political agency in order to take this to the voters. They believed that a public park surrounded by natural beauty with amenities that children could go and enjoy a childhood, which had been non-existent for the impoverished classes previously, so you had to go to work to support if you even reached that age, that Greenfield Lake would somehow take the lower middle classes and instill within them the morals and values that would make them gentlemen or gentle men. Now, of course, it goes without saying the extreme limitations of that. Sally Hicks was a wealthy woman. So did it work? I'm not going to wax poetic on that. But that's what's going on in Sally Hicks' mind. And that's how it is reflected after her death in Greenfield Park. Now, I have a disclaimer. If anybody knows what happened to that statue, I would love to know, because I can't find out. I have asked around, I don't know, I've been searching for this thing for like 7 years. Where did it go? I know that it came into disrepair. We know through the newspaper records in the 70s and 80s, it was vandalized and so forth. And then it just kind of goes away. And I can't figure out where it went, if it exists anymore. Should it go back to where it was? I'm not sure, but I would love to take a look at it and see what kind of condition it is today. So in typical Travis, I've got more to share than I think we have time, so I'm going to keep speeding along with this. So this is during Sally Hicks' tenure. We have established the park for progressive reasons to uplift the lower middle classes, put them into beauty, into nature, give them amenities to enjoy childhood. This is a Sanborn map from about 10 years before that referendum is passed successfully. I can't find a later Sanborn map with all the fixings. So we're going to have to naturally assume that what you're seeing in the Sanborn fire insurance map is what existed once it becomes a public park, thanks to Sally Hicks. And what you're seeing is this is Park Road or Burnett Boulevard or South 3rd Street. This is where that gas station or quick station is today. And you have several outbuildings. You have a dock or a ramp. And then you have this over-the-water dance pavilion. Here's your spillway, and that is where the mill still is. The spillway, remember in the 18th century, used to flood the fields. Rice falls out of fashion, so we turn it into a grist mill to grind corn because corn is more profitable. It's still there where the spillway is. The statue would have been just to the south of that on this little peninsula there, because that postcard is taken from that perspective. What I've been told, well, here, this is what this looks like when you juxtapose it with a Louis Timor collection. I get a shout out North Carolina room at the Hanover County Public Library. Go support your local special collections librarians. They are awesome. And also, thank you to Susan Taylor Block, who was instrumental in making this photograph collection. It's publicly accessible to all of us for uses like this today. So when you put it, the red circle, that is the floating dock, or that is the ramp. And then the purple, that is the over-the-water pavilion. And I'm going to show you a better picture of what that looks like in a minute. These over-the-water pavilions were all the rage in the 20s. I'm going to make a strong statement, and it is my opinion, so don't take this as fact, is I bet you any money that was designed by Henry Wilmington. He was an architect in Wilmington in the late 19th and early 20th century, and one of his pet projects was he went to any entertainment or amusement complex in southeastern North Carolina, and he built these dance pavilions. He built one at Carolina Beach. He built one at Wrightsville Beach, who eventually becomes the famous Lumina Pavilion. This is a small Lumina out here at Greenfield Lake. This is a dance pavilion. You're going to go out there at night, hear a big band, and dance until you're out past your curfew. And it's a little hip roof, German clapboard building. Has a little cupola there because I'm sure with all that dancing, it got really hot in there. That hot air rise, you want to escape out of that velvety cupola. And then here you have your kids swimming around that dance pavilion, where they actually imported that sand from the beach to give you a nice sandy bottom on the lake. So we all know there's not much sand down there today. And then back here is where your ramp was. So we're going to keep looking at these pictures, but I'm going to introduce another character for us, the third individual that helped create intentionally the design historic landscape of Greenfield Lake. That's James E.L. Wade, and he's known as Hi Jimmy Wade, because he went all across town. He'd be like, "Hi Jimmy, hi buddy." So you hear him, "Hi buddy, hi Jimmy." Everybody knew him Jimmy in town. And for our purposes, he is the Commissioner of Public Works. But this gentleman would go on to serve as mayor of Wilmington. He would serve several decades at the state legislature. He was a prominent politician in the mid-20th century. But his later popularity was created due to his intense commitment to parks in Wilmington when he was Commissioner of Public Works. And I was told that Keep the River Watch gets tons of questions about the zoo. People want to know about the zoo. And Commissioner Wade is a great individual to show you how that zoo came to be. And I love those quotes. Those bears, pheasants, monkeys, and other things in the zoo were all donated. So let's dive into the zoo a little bit. Most people, I think, when you go to the park today, where the boathouse is managed by the Cape Fear River Watch, there is a restroom facility that is made, it looks like, by rock, correct? Also, a little bit further away, there's an open air pergola. It's also made of rock that has some wooden trusses. That is not the original zoo. Most folks think that is where the zoo was because they get confused, or maybe mom or dad or grandpa has a memory of the little train that went around that area. That was all a later fruition. I'm going to break that down for you. The zoo, in fact, originally was on the opposite side of 3rd Street, on the side where like Benny Big's Pizza is today, or Southfront Apartments. It was on that side of the street originally. And this is how you break it down. So here's our Sanborn maps, and take a look at this yellow house. I blew it up. Yellow in a Sanborn map means it's a wooden house. And the front of it here, we have a full-length porch, and then we know that there is a shed roof appendage in the back. When you look at Louis T. Moore's picture, I'm going to show you the full picture in a minute, but this is a close-up. Here we have that house in the picture. How do we know it's that house? Well, there's wooden clapboard siding. We have a full front porch, and in the back here, we have a little shed roof appendage that's depicted on this smaller square in the back. Take this even further, in the Sanborn map, you have another wooded building southwest of that house. Well, you see it back here beyond that house. That's where that other building is. So let's blow this picture out. This picture actually is a picture of the zoo at the time in which Ms. Hicks is advocating for the public ownership of Greenfield Lake, at the time in which Commissioner Wade is adding all these fixings like a zoo to make it attractive, a place to go see. So here you have that house. This is South 3rd Street or Burnett Boulevard. We're looking west because there's no lake back there. And here you have the entrance to the park with all these terrible cages for these animals that were donated. So the park is on the opposite side. Today, there's a Parks and Recreation facility on that part of the street. So you're not supposed to believe me because you're a historian, you're supposed to challenge me, right? So don't ever believe what a historian tells you. Fight against it. So I'm going to give you another quote just to reinforce what I've told you. And that is a quote from 1972 when they remodeled the zoo for one final time. The zoo by 1972 had become not an eyesore, but it was falling out of fashion. You know, if you put animals in cages like that, I'm thinking there wouldn't be too many fans today of the city of Wilmington. So it's becoming out of fashion. So in 1972, there was just a big PR campaign. We're going to make this a natural habitat. And in the Star News, there's a small little nugget of a quote. It says, the park originated in 1924 in the 1700 block of South 3rd Street and was moved across the street in 1962. So there is your written quote that reinforces visually what we're seeing in Louis T. Moore's photograph and that previous Sanborn map. So it was moved to where you're thinking, where the boat ramp is and so forth in 1962. And then there's a little close up of the pens. We have some fawns in there. Isn't that a beautiful natural habitat? No wonder the PR campaign went out. So this is what the plan was in 1972 when we're going to make this more natural, okay? To make it more palpable for the public at large that these animals are not you know, in these horrible conditions in these pens. So there is your railroad, your kiddie railroad. That is the covered shelter you see today where the pergola is. This is 4th Street. So the pergola would have been the furthest west the zoo went. Everything would be, if you're standing in that pergola, you'd be looking back towards the beach, back towards 4th Street. There is kind of gardens and a parking lot there today. And you have all kinds of animals there. And our friend Commissioner Wade was not lying when he said things were donated. So I looked it up for you. This is some fun ones. There was an armadillo. It was donated by Fred Nelson from Rocky Mount. There was a 300-pound hog bear, and it was captured by the modern-day Department of Natural Resources from Teaching, North Carolina. Teaching, North Carolina. There were ring-tailed monkeys. Those were donated by the the New York Zoo Management. There were about 20 ducks. They were donated by H.C. Blake. That's a big name in town from Blake Dairy. It was up towards kind of like Castle Hayne. There was an elephant. There was a little baby elephant that was purchased again from the New York Zoo Management. And this is the fun. Commissioner Wade, he's a cheap guy. He knew what he was doing. All that political success later, he's like, I get this all donated. The elephant was purchased from the New York Zoo Management as a baby, and the funds were raised by school children in Gilbert County. Think of like a battleship. Commissioner Wade launched this campaign where they, I guess, their milk money or so forth. And then 2 of my favorite, the lions were donated by the John Robinson Circus, and then there was a rattlesnake with 12 rattles that was donated by the John Robinson Circus as well. Unfortunately, and it adds into why in 1972 there was a big PR campaign to make this a natural habitat, the armadillo died like 10 years later, and it just says in the paper that it could not stand the conditions of the zoo. So it's not a good chapter in our history. I'm thinking the zoo not being there is an excellent thing. So let's wrap this up. It's 9:50. I want to wrap it up with Dr. William Houston Moore. This quote from him from 1946 should play a lot into SALLIE HICKS. Parks, well-kept streets, and plazas have a cultural effect on people and help build character. That marble statue of Mrs. Hicks pulling that young man out of poverty in this beautiful surrounding of Greenfield Lake. So Dr. Moore is the individual responsible for collating all these nonprofit organizations, North Carolina SOROSIS, the Cape Fear Garden Club, the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, and so forth, to donate plantings to create this beautiful atmosphere around Greenfield Lake. It first started with it was called a Greenfield Association, and that was formed in 1938, and Dr. Moore was the chairperson. And that was kind of the umbrella organization that convinced all these other organizations to donate plantings. So we're talking about Mr. Boyd donated palmettos from Bald Head Island. They're still there today around the Veterans Memorial. Orton Plantation, they donated azalea beds and buds that are within the landscape today out there. We're talking about various other women's federation clubs in the north that are donating non-natural or non-native species from their gardens, from their parks up north to be included into Greenfield Lake. And you create these wonderful, intentionally designed landscapes all around Greenfield Lake. Commissioner Wade was very cheap. The ballast stones. Take a look at that flower bed by ballast stones. He has a quote in the Star News, or excuse me, the Wilmington Morning Star that I pulled out. All those ballast stones were intentionally keep the costs down low and maintain this park. We understood that Southern progressivism has its limitations in fiscal conservatism. So the way to make this progressive movement successful, to lift up the lower classes, this natural beauty, is to keep the costs down low so the administration could swallow it. And that's why so many of the flower beds you see today, the pergola, that building, they're all built from discarded ballast stone found downtown, because this isn't Commissioner Wade's full-time job. He's the public works. So what he's doing at the same time is macadamizing all the streets in downtown Wilmington. He's creating the water and sewer that is now Cape Fear public utility. So when they're ripping up those streets, what are they finding? A lot of ballast stone. Where are you going to put it? Oh, we're going to make flower beds out of it. You can make pergolas out of it. You can adaptively reuse or salvage those resources. That should sound familiar. Legacy architectural salvage, right? Also, he was instrumental in creating community drive. So this started in 1931. And what we wanted to do is create a 5-mile paved road around Greenfield Lake to increase the accessibility of the park. And it started with local funds. What would happen is everybody, there was a campaign led by Dr. Moore who would donate a month's pay. And that would subsidize the unemployed during the Great Depression, the later years of the Great Depression, to go out here and labor on community drive. And it was interesting. I wanted to pull what that meant out. So white workers received $10, and then unfortunately, black workers received $7.50. So inequity at this time in the creation of community drive. But all that was subsidized by wealthier individuals, community members in Wilmington, donating their month's pay to these workers. And Louis T. Moore has fantastic examples. So that is Lakeshore Drive today. It was redeveloped in the 1970s. So what you see today kind of has some 20th century later fixings on top, but the pathway is largely the same, forged by these men. And in 1952, they created a monument along Community Drive, or Lakeshore Drive, dedicated to the workers that went out here and created it. Eventually, the Works Progress Administration subsidized the continued improvements of Community Drive. But it did start, it's important to know, it started here locally. Before the WPA latched onto the project, it was subsidized here locally by leading business persons. Wrapping up here, all these improvements under Dr. Moore's tenure with all these organizations like the Cape Fear Garden Club, they created this landscaped design that had these designed inclined planes so you could walk straight to the edge of the lake. Enjoy the cypress and the palmettos. There were magnolias that were planted around, you can still find today. But you always could go to the shore of the lake and the sight lines would be open. That's what these men are doing, creating that community drive around the perimeter of the lake. They're not only building this road, but they're clearing out the sight lines, because who wants to drive around a road when it's just scrub and brush and you can't see the view of the lake, right? And of course, with a lake, you don't have those, that's not natural to have that nice inclined plane so you can access the lake shore. It was all done intentionally. It's not what you have today. And that's what today's call to action is. This is from the Robert Fales collection. He had a house in South Fifth Avenue. It's another great collection, North Carolina. There's Commissioner Wade in his old age after he was mayor in Greenfield Lake. Still have your sight lines. So Sam Lee, we have incredible employees at the city of Wilmington. We have incredible employees in Parks and Recreation that are very dedicated to Greenfield Lake. So this is your call to action. The historic design landscape was intentionally placed, but it has suffered in the past few decades. Sightlines are not open. There's invasive species. Accessibility is a problem. Interpretation is a problem. So the city of Wilmington is committed to a master plan to return Greenfield Lake to its roots. Includes landscaping and maintenance, open those shorelines, determine personnel needs, programming, capital projects, and so forth. There was a survey open until June 30th. It's closed now, but eventually they're going to formulate what that survey of us citizens said and come up with action plans. That's when I want you all to speak out. You take what you learned today, add on it to your own research, and make sure that when this master plan comes to an action item, we are preserving and conserving the intentional historic design landscape that is Greenfield Lake. So if there's anything I can leave you with today is, hopefully that showed you through these four individuals that nothing was by accident in what we see in Greenfield Lake today. From the lake itself to a planting of azalea. It was all intentional. So that means we have a great burden or a great obligation to ensure that the preservation, the conservation of that historic design landscape is intentional as well. Like I said, I was trying to get it before 10 because I talked.
Well, there's a delay, so you're fine.
All right, let's don't stump me now.
I'm sorry I'm taking the first question, everybody. That was amazing. I have two questions. So the original purpose from the city of Wilmington was that bought, who did they buy it from? The original slave owners family? Or,
No, it was.
I might have missed it.
Yes, that's a great question. It's not as straightforward. So how do I break this down? What we know as Greenfield Lake was not one land transfer. In fact, it was small parcels over time that have added up to make Greenfield Park as we know it today. The first land transfer that was passed in the 1925 referendum is what we would consider east of 3rd Street, where the boat docks are, that kind of area there. And it was purchased from an amusement park company called Howard Wells Amusement. It's kind of like an LLC of sorts that had owned that part of Greenfield Lake and then bequeathed it or sold it to the city for $25,000 through that referendum. And then there are other parcels as the city limits expanded to include the lake that were purchased, donated, added in later, like the sunken gardens, like where the Rotary mazes and so forth. That was in the 60s, even in the 70s that this continued to occur. Because in 1925, the city limits only expanded to the northern perimeter of the lake and actually did not include the lake or anything to the west, east, or south of it. So of course, that referendum, they're limited to the city's jurisdiction, which at that time was just where the boat docks are.
And then the water, so you know when almost get one of your phrases, did it just go out of fashion city, or was it sort of aligned with City of Wilmington getting stormwater service organization and understanding that the lake is sort of become a stormwater retention concept?
Yeah,
It's a bad way of saying it. It's not a stormwater retention. It's a beautiful urban lake, beautiful history,
right.
but obviously we know it's highly polluted. I'm just wondering when people start swimming in water.
I'm going to make a very educated guess. By the Great Depression, the pavilion had been lost, the ramp had been lost. Those amenities that helped accessibility to swim in the lake had been lost, and then the rise of beaches correspond with the loss of amenities. And I would assume, although I cannot prove to you, so I don't know for certain, it was a slow, gradual falling out of favor because it was less easy to swim there, and then the beaches and accessibility to the beaches, thanks to the automobile and so forth, increased. So it just didn't happen overnight. It was just kind of like one of those things that one day you woke up and it was like, oh my gosh, we haven't swam in Greenfield Lake for 30 years. So, but I don't know for certain. Yeah, we're not advised swimming there now. It's like baptisms. When you do newspaper searches for Greenfield Lake, baptisms are a big thing at Greenfield Lake. Before you swam in Greenfield Lake, you got baptized. Before it was even Greenfield, it was McKinley's Pond. So there was so much more you could add into this, and I did the whole baptism and death by suicide was a big use of the lake as well. So there are many different uses. There were so many people you could use to tell this story. But baptisms and that more unfortunate event are some of the precursors to swimming as well.
So I had also two questions. One, I got to look at old pictures of me, and I do a lot of bird watching out there.
Yeah.
Was there a boat at one point, like I know in the 50s, looking at old pictures, was there like a small like boat that went around that had like seats?
There was, yeah, there was a small motorized paddle boat, had a rear paddle that went around, and then Commissioner Wade was the first individual that got kayak and canoe rentals there in the 20s and 30s as well. So that small paddle boat was the thing until the late 70s. Okay, I don't know. That's cool. Yeah, it's kind of fun. I should have put a picture in. There's a great picture on the cover of a local periodical that has the whole azalea fort on that small paddle. Was not like the size of the Henrietta. It's much, much smaller. We're talking about one level of seating, maybe a dozen people on a small little paddle. That is cool.
My mom came here like in the late 70s, so she never trained too with it, and what left in the food.
Yeah.
But the other thing also, that also though, like these are the good conservation things for birds. So I'm kind of glad that this is here. So I guess, and I didn't ask the survey thing. So I guess when did it become popular? You know, you made it really kind of like as like for like bird watching and things like that.
It's a great question. I actually attribute much of that to the Riverwatch, to be honest. I think that in my tenure in Wilmington, which is not long, but much of the interaction from Greenfield Lake is for conservation purposes now. And from my perspective, the mouthpiece of that has been Riverwatch. And we're thankful for that. Before that, I'm not sure. But I do hear you. I think there's that's an overture for the use of the park. Any other questions? Right. It's not deep, or wasn't. Not deep. I don't know exactly. But in the pictures, they're out to that pavilion, and you can still see heads, and they're not swimming. Like their shoulders and heads, perspectives in some of these pictures. You go on North Carolina County Public website and see more pictures than I could possibly share today. And like I said, their perspectives, they're clearly standing on bottom out towards that pavilion. So 2 feet, 3 feet.
Nowadays, dog in the bottom can't stand. I mean, like, so you're going to see.
Any idea when alligators are showing up in the lake?
When were the alligators? Thank you for hitting on that. Something that I had this has been like so many things. I've gotten to the point where I've forgotten more things than I know at this point. So I had to like refresh this presentation. But something I learned several years ago is I feel very strongly about this. It's pretty darn clear in the primary evidence, in the primary resource evidence, that the alligators were introduced into Greenfield Lake by man. They did not come there naturally. Why I know that is in Commissioner Wade, I listed off all those animals at the Adobe. Stan was, went on these PR campaigns, and it's like, if I don't bring some kind of weird animal back, they're not gonna like me. At one point in the late 20s and early 30s, there are records of alligators being introduced into the spillway or the causeway to create this south ambiance that was intentional. Think about Mrs. Hicks. She was alive during that. As the Southern Progressive, there are limitations to that movement. And much of the progressivism of Southern Women at this time was by looking back, because that would make it more palpable for the men that were in leadership, right? So the Spanish moss, they're introducing them. They're putting Spanish moss on these trees. They're intentionally creating an aesthetic. We can see that down at Baldhead. We had a live oak on our lighthouse grounds. And it's like, yeah, the live oak on there naturally. Somebody, the Bishop kids put it on there. So where was I going with this? So there are evidence in the late 20s of alligators being introduced into the spillway or the causeway, which was fenced in. We know it was fenced in because of the geese that were introduced as well. And there were areas in the spillway that were segregated by animals and still in. And then all of a sudden, like, there are more alligator reports from there. So I feel very strongly that they were introduced by man there. I think maybe a biologist would have a different perspective, or somebody from that. But the material evidence suggests man introduced. Like the geese. The geese were eventually let loose in the lake. Thank you all so much for your time.